Welcome to Rail Families United. In this series, we will be looking at what I call deadly training materials as they were used with frontline rail workers at CN Rail. If you look at what I have on this slide, the page on the left is what was the cover page for the Transport Canada Health and Safety Officer investigation report into the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. If you look here, you will see that the first arrow at the top here says extended jurisdiction for rail. That's an issue because the labor code, and this person would have provided, after the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, he had written up 4 violations of labor code practices against CN Rail, which would be covered in the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal hearings pertaining to this death. But pretty well in all other industries, it would not be Transport Canada that would be investigating labor code violations. It would have been the Ministry of Labor. And that's a huge issue because it used to be that the Ministry of Labor was involved in issues like this, but for some reason that entire jurisdiction was pretty well given to Transport Canada. And so if Transport Canada becomes a rail partner in crime, as I like to call them, there's an issue with that because there's not that second entity, which would have been the Ministry of Labor, looking into these issues. So if there's some corruption going on or some bad practices, they can much more easily be swept under the carpet by the removal of the Ministry of Labor from the rail workforce jurisdiction. And that's a huge issue. So anyway, that's what that extended jurisdiction, I think, refers to. Then if you look here, again, it just shows that this was a report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. The report came out in September of 2014. The Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal hearings, those didn't happen until years later, end of 2016. There's a reason that there's time and distance. We like to stretch things out in the government of Canada because who's going to care after several years about a conductor trainee who was killed in the wheat fields of Saskatchewan? Who's going to care other than the family? Who is going to remember this incident? Much more easily all swept under the carpet with time and distance. The other thing here is the name of the Transport Canada Health and Safety Officer appears on this report. His name was Tyrone Kowalski. And the page number here, if you look at the bottom here on the left, that's a page number that is provided when I did a Freedom of Information request to get all information that I could get pertaining to the death of this young conductor trainee who had been killed at CN Rail. Now, the first thing that we're going to be looking at here has to do with Canadian Rail Operating Rules, specifically number 104, as it was taught at CN Rail. Now, in this report, and this page on the training slide number 53 was also included in a presentation or other materials that I had requested via Freedom of Information. And in one area, the Government of Canada completely blacked it out, but in this other area, they didn't. So I was able to see, you can't make out here what's on the top right-hand corner of this slide, but it's basically a picture of an actual track configuration for what's in the diagram. But the things I need you to look at here is that this is called switching at turnouts. And CN Rail training slide number 53 is what I call the deadly training slide number 53. And I'll show you why in a moment. It says here, turnouts are track structures used to move rail equipment from one track to another. That's true. Switch points determine the direction the train will follow. Okay, so this is the actual slide used by CN Rail, and again, it was page 71 of the Transport Canada Health and Safety Officer report in matters pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Now, we're going to be looking at this slide a lot more closely. Okay, so what we have here is what I call deadly training slide number 53. As it was used by CN Rail to train potentially thousands of frontline conductor trainees. Okay, and you know, since conductor trainees go on to become conductors, go on to become locomotive engineers, there are 6 of 9 categories that overlap. And when you go to locomotive engineer training, you don't restart from scratch. What you've learned in the 6 categories out of 9 while you were a conductor trainee, those stay with you. You don't relearn those. So if you were taught the wrong materials as a conductor trainee, you keep that with you in the back of your mind as a locomotive engineer. So let's look at deadly training slide number 53. On the left here, I have that diagram. I flipped it over so it's more easily compared to an actual track configuration of what that is supposed to represent as far as switching at turnouts. And on the right, this picture here is an actual, would be for switching at a turnout because that's a turnout. But here's the issue. If you look at the picture itself on the right, I have an arrow there pointing to what I call the broken rail. That broken rail, if it appears on the left, and you can see the solid line here, the solid piece of rail, if it appears on the left, the train would be going straight. If it appears on the right, the train would be going to the right. In other words, taking the turnoff. So if we look at the diagram, it's pretty well the same. The broken rail is on the left, not on the right. So this is a slide that is called switching at turnouts. The problem with the slide is that it is showing a configuration, a track configuration for a train not going on the turnout, but rather for a train that is going straight. So in other words, you are showing the exact opposite of the track configuration that you should be showing for a train that is taking a turnout. So the picture, the diagram, I found that a lot of the materials I was provided by Transport Canada or the Government of Canada, when I requested this information, they tried to blur out a lot of stuff, either black it out completely or make it extremely hard to see it. But clearly there is no broken rail on the right on the diagram. It is only on the left that it can be here. So that's why it's a deadly training slide. You're showing the wrong track configuration for what you're trying to teach a conductor trainee when you're using this particular slide. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out is that the picture on the right here is not the picture that you see on the actual training slide. The configuration's the same, but this is not the actual picture that shows up on the training slide. What this picture I obtained through Freedom of Information when I requested all materials tied to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. So this is the actual location where conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed because he flipped a switch the wrong way. Now, there are those who definitely think that he was being qualified the day he was killed. And we'll go into that more later. But, you know, if you were going to be qualified or taking your field test, in other words, the odds that you would be going over your training materials the previous night would be pretty high. And so if he had this training slide, in his training materials or had drawn the diagram for switching at turnouts, and this is what it looks like, that could certainly explain why he flipped a switch the wrong way the day that he was killed. And conductor trainee Jason Clooney, again, was working unsupervised in unfamiliar territory on the day he was killed. His supposed supervising conductor, who had never been trained in how to supervise a conductor trainee, by the way, that person was working almost 2/3 of a mile away in the dark. And so you've got a conductor trainee working alone in the dark in unfamiliar territory without supervision in violation of the law, namely statutory orders and regulations number 87-150, section 5. And so, and the other thing I wanted to mention here is that this picture was not taken on the day that conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. It was clearly taken, in the following year. Conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed in late November of 2013, and there was actually snow on the ground a little bit when he was killed, and I know that because of other pictures I have pertaining to this death. So this is the same location, but this picture was clearly taken much, much later. And I just wanted to show you what you see also here going across would be like the track, where the switch is located. You kind of see this large section going across the track here. That would be where the actual switch is located further off to the right there. But anyways, again, the point is the broken rail, if this train was taking a turnout, would have been on the right, not on the left. But if you're a conductor trainee and you've been taught in class that this is the configuration for a train taking a turnout, as was clearly the case in deadly training slide number 53, then, if you're asked to flip a switch so that the train is going straight, you would have done the opposite. You would have made it so that the broken rail was to the right, because you would have thought, if what's taught on the training slide is for turnouts, the opposite of that, well, the broken rail should be on the right. And when you do that, you're making the train go to the right. So in other words, the switch was reversed onto himself. He had his back to the switch and to the oncoming train while he was installing a derail, unsupervised, unfamiliar territory, in the dark, with no supervisor whatsoever to act as a lookout for a person that CN also knew had problems with switching operations and with working alone. So this, in my opinion, was a complete disaster, and I suspect again that, if conductor trainee Jason Clooney was being qualified the day he was killed, and there are definitely those who believe that he was, then, the odds are he was looking at his training materials the night before he was killed. That's just common sense. Just my opinion based on other things I know. But we'll look into some of those issues a little more closely later. But the point again, this is a training slide showing the wrong track configuration for switching at turnouts. It is showing a track configuration for a train going straight. Okay, so I flipped this slide back to the original position so that you can just again look, and now that you know what you're looking for, that broken rail, you can clearly see that it is on the top part of the slide here of the track configuration in the diagram at the bottom. And so that would mean that if the broken rail is on the left, again, this would have been a configuration for a train going straight. The exact opposite of what should have been shown on deadly training slide number 53. Okay, there's several things that I wanted to show here pertaining to this slide also, deadly training slide number 53. So again, note the comment at the top of the slide stating that the slide was provided by the employer here. So at the very top here, where it says, you know, in this Transport Canada Health and Safety Officer report, it was CN Rail that provided this slide to the Health and Safety Officer. And on this note, I wanted to say something else. The Health and Safety Officer, when, you know, after his investigation or maybe at the same time, he would end up doing a presentation that was several pages long, and I'll have to look at exactly how long that thing was, but it was a presentation that was made by the Health and Safety Officer for Transport Canada to CN Rail. And since I had requested a copy of all materials pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, this presentation was also included. The only problem was it was completely blacked out. Couldn't see a single thing, and other than maybe a title here and there. And I suspect that that presentation had to do with all the violations of the law, of the codes, of whatever, that were involved in the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. The fact is, folks, that the salary of the Transport Canada Health and Safety Officer, and hence the people who paid for that presentation, it wasn't CN Rail, it was the taxpayer of Canada. And so why was that all blacked out? That should have been released when I requested information tied to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. They tried to black out this slide. They blacked it out in one place, but not in the other. And I think it was in that presentation also. But anyways, so, you know, God has a way of making things come out. But this one was critical enough that it's incriminating enough in and of itself. But I think that taxpayers have a right to see what was in those presentation materials for a very so special presentation that was just for the eyes of CN Rail, paid for by taxpayers. You know, there's a lot of shady stuff going on, in my opinion, when it comes to the rail industry and death investigations and, you know, safety actions taken. If you want real safety actions taken, you need accountability and you need transparency. And that is definitely not what we have today. So anyways, this slide was provided by the employer. I got it through Freedom of Information. And it discussed again Rule 104, which had to do with switching operations. And this slide again is entitled Switching at Turnouts. And as such, trainees or anyone really would consider this a training slide on switching at turnouts and not one specifically on checking the points for the intended route as required by the Canadian Rail Operating Rule number 104. Rule 104 says that you have to check the points for the intended route. And there's a lot of issues with that comment and what's actually taught in the field or was taught when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. There's a lot of people that thought they had to check the points in order to make sure there was no ice on the tracks. That's not the main reason for checking the points. You need to check the points to make sure the track is aligned for the intended route. So we'll see a little more on that in other videos in this in these video series on deadly training slide number 53. So the fact that there is first a statement pertaining to the definition of a turnout would further solidify the concept for trainees that has to do with turnouts. So it says here, turnouts are track structures used to move rail equipment from one track to another. So this is clearly about turnouts. The comment pertaining to points determining the direction of that the train will follow is the third thing indicated on this slide after the title and definition of a turnout. So again, making this slide appear to be one on turnouts as opposed to one on training specifically on Canadian Rail Operating Rule 104 as it pertains to checking the points for the intended route. You know, when you're in technical writing, the most important stuff is usually at the top or at the very end of something. So, you know, if it's switching at turnouts is at the top rather than, you know, check the points for the intended route. This was a slide for switching at turnouts with the wrong configuration, and it was also used for Rule 104. So you may say it's for Rule 104, but really it isn't, because that comment on Rule 104 discussion is continued in the training program slides provided by the employer. That's a comment that came in by the Transport Canada Health and Safety Officer. There is nothing in training slide 53 in and of itself that says that this is for teaching Rule 104, which is on checking the points for the intended route. This looks like just a slide for switching at turnouts, and here's the track configuration of what it should look like. Let's see. Other than the reference points A, B, and C on this diagram, there is nothing that is labeled on this training slide. We're not told exactly what points A, B, and C are supposed to be to actually, or what they actually represent. Okay, we are all these could be considered switch points by a trainee, or are they to represent something else specifically? You don't know. You don't know. What is point A? Is that supposed to be where the switch is? What is point B? What is point C? You're not told anything. You're just supposed to assume everything. And it's not good to let people assume, especially in safety critical tasks and materials tied to those safety critical tasks, like switching. So the switch point itself is not labeled on a slide that is supposed to be teaching trainees about checking the points for the intended route. That's not really what they're showing here. It says switch points determine the direction of that the train will follow, but the switch points aren't labeled. Where's the switch point? It's not apparently the broken rail. The switch point is supposed to be where the tracks or the rails join together. And so they're supposed to check the switch points to ensure that they're properly aligned, that there's no ice on them, whatever. But as we'll see further on in training materials, it doesn't say specifically what they were checking the points for in the test questions, whatever. So there's a lot that leaves to be desired when it comes to this deadly training slide. So although there is a line with an arrow at the beginning and end on the straight piece of track, as indicated by points A to B, we are not told what specifically that line with two arrows going from point A to B is supposed to represent. So again, what is that? On a slide for switching at turnouts, why wouldn't the arrow have been from point A to point C if it's for switching at turnouts? This is again showing a track configure. This is showing you point A to point B is basically showing you that the train's going to be going straight here. But this is supposed to be a slide for switching at turnouts. So point A to point B, that arrow going from one to the other is actually showing a track configuration for a train going straight. And that's what you have here on a slide for switching at turnouts. The exact opposite of what you should be showing. Although also another thing that's missing, there are no north, south, east, or west indicators or labels on any of the training slide points. And then the switch itself also appears to be missing. It may be the vertical line that's indicated just to the right of point A. So on the very far left there, you see that kind of dark line going across the track. That is very likely where the switch would extend out further down in the diagram, and that would be where you'd see the switch, but you don't see it here. You just see this dark line going through there. That is likely where the switch would be located. The funny little squiggles, which appear to be guide rails, they're also called frogs. That, if you look on point C there, for the piece of track that's going from A to C, those dark lines kind of in the middle of the track segment, those are what are called frogs. So, but none of this is, labeled for the trainee. So those are for the train's wheel flanges, and they are also not labeled, nor are the many names which would be used in the field for these components provided. So, there's a lot of different names that people use in the field, and nothing is labeled here. And then there appears to be a rather small picture of an actual track in the upper right corner. But on this slide provided by the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, it's very hard to make out when it comes to any details there. But, it's an actual track configuration, an actual picture of what the track looks like in reality to match the diagram below. So I used the one that I actually got for conductor trainee Jason Clooney. So what are the potential implications of all these problems with this training slide? The fact that it's not labeled, it's showing the wrong track configuration for switching at turnouts. There's so many problems with this training slide. So, when you think about all the people that get trained with these materials, conductor trainees that become conductors, yard masters, probably yard foremen, people who go on to become locomotive engineers. There's a lot of problems when you look at this and you start realizing the implications of it all. Okay, if you look at the Health and Safety Officer report on page 72, which would be immediately following page 71, which had this deadly training slide on it. So in spite of many problems with the specific switching at turnouts training slide, the HSO, or Health and Safety Officer Kowalski, in his final report dated September 12th, 2014, he stated on page 72 the following: as shown in figure 2.37, slide 53 illustrates the switch points and correctly explains these as determining the direction the railway equipment or train will follow. So that's the green arrow. That is correct. On this slide, turnouts are track structures used to move rail equipment from one track to another. That is correct. He's right in saying that. But what does he not say? What he doesn't say is that this is a slide for switching at turnouts and that it is showing the wrong track configuration for a train that would be turning at a turnout. So here it says the switch points determine the direction the train will follow. Yeah, they do. But what he fails to say here is that in this configuration, the switch points would have been showing the wrong configuration for a train switching at a turnout, and that these switch points were actually for a train going straight. He doesn't specifically spell it out. Why not? So the only thing that's accurate, in my opinion, is the green arrow here. He's got that right, the definition of what a turnout is. But as far as the other information on this, when it comes to turnouts, this information is not about turnouts. It shows a configuration for a track going straight. And, yeah, the switch points do determine the direction the train will follow. But in this case, it's for a train going straight. So why didn't he spell it out? Then he says, training slide 58 notes the Canadian Rail Operating Rule 104 and includes instructor notes for an exercise with the students, encouraging them to become familiar with Rule 104. So, I requested all training materials, everything, through Freedom of Information. And after years of fighting with the Government of Canada, they still refused to release this information. And it's critical. The stuff I requested, there's a reason I requested it, folks. I was looking for very specific information. And you'll see a lot more of that as we get through this series on deadly training materials. Okay, we're going to end here for today. This concludes part 1 of deadly training materials. Again, make sure you look at the videos in the sequence in which they are provided, because they do build on one another. And like, share, and subscribe. And if you have subscribed, make sure that you double check to make sure you haven't been unsubscribed, because I don't doubt that the Government of Canada will definitely try to unsubscribe people, because this is not information that they want to see get out. But it does affect 2 countries now, because CN has massive rail lines in the U.S., and the Government of Canada, quite frankly, allowed a lot of executives to escape to the U.S. to infest that rail industry and do a lot of things that, were greatly to the detriment of the U.S. rail sector. So we'll continue with part 2. Have a great day.